Heal from narcissistic abuse by taking others' support for granted. Did you work extremely hard to make your narcissistic parent or partner happy, yet always seem to be falling behind? Was it especially dangerous to expect anything from them? And was it impossible to assume they were going to be happy with you? Well, these questions point to the pseudo-reality that a narcissistic abuser works to impose upon the person in particularly the scapegoated role to them. And in so doing, the narcissistic person elevates their own needs to the forefront and renders the scapegoat's needs as either non-existent or even offensive. And one of the problems for the scapegoated person at the time is that they have no one in their corner. That is, they have no one upon whom they can assume cares for them, persists that caring stance even when not being tended to, and upon whom the scapegoat can essentially forget about, or as I've said in the title today, take for granted. And I'm using the phrase take for granted because I've heard many survivors of a narcissistic parent say that their parent accused them of this throughout their upbringing. So the scapegoat survivor assumed that they must be selfish and emotionally callous for this parent to be accusing them of this. And often these survivors would work to not take the narcissistic parent for granted as that parent was accusing them of. Here's the injustice in this scenario. A child is supposed to be able to take a parent's love and support for granted. In fact, all relationships require some measure of taking the other person for granted. It's what allows us to make use of relationships in a real way, to be able to receive as well as give, not just one or the other. So a narcissistic parent who weaponizes this phrase against the scapegoat survivor or child at the time can make that child turn against their own very healthy needs to take others for granted at times. In today's video, I'm going to discuss how and why a narcissistic parent targets the scapegoat's efforts to take others for granted in a healthy way. In response, the scapegoat child may develop a morality and corresponding feelings of shame that is centered on self-denial. For example, the right thing to do for the scapegoat child is to put themselves last, and then failure to do this can result in profound feelings of shame. That's kind of how this morality works that I'll explain more about. Next, I'll explain how it's the narcissistic parent who's actually the one taking the scapegoat child for granted without any reciprocation of the favor. Third, I'm going to reframe what taking for granted can mean for a scapegoat survivor from something exploitative to a sense of really healthy entitlement that's good for oneself. And last, I'll point towards a resource to move through and heal the shame you may feel when trying to take others for granted today. You may also feel some danger in doing so too. Well, my name's Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in helping people recover from narcissistic abuse. So this is a form of abuse which can leave the survivor feeling lost and estranged from a sort of basic sense of who they are in the world. And in individual therapy and through my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse, I try to offer a map that allows survivors to come back to the quality of life that they, at some level, know they've always deserved. And of course, each person's got to travel their own kind of unique path. But I think this form of a map can be very helpful along the way. And I think there are three features to this map, which I call the 3 pillars of recovery, that are particularly important. The first pillar is making sense of what happened so you know the abuse was not your fault. The second pillar is gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser. And this can be psychological, emotional, or physical distance. The third pillar is living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. And I don't think anyone can do this in a vacuum. It's, I think, essential to find and participate in communities of people and in relationships where you can feel validated, supported, and understood in what you're working on and towards in your process of recovery. So my online course on recovery from narcissistic abuse offers a strategy that corresponds to these three pillars and provides a community within which to do it via an accompanying private Facebook group for members of the course. You can check it out by clicking here or find the link in the description box below. And to let you know, today's video falls under pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And all of these videos are organized into playlists which correspond to one of the 3 pillars. So if you want to, again, binge on a certain theme, you're welcome to do so. So if you were a scapegoat survivor of a narcissistic parent or partner, then I would encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner of the narcissistic abuser, whether it's self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you had to adopt in order to survive, or to why the narcissistic personality is so geared to putting those closest to them down. I think this ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems or pathology. You can find the link, again, in the description box below or by clicking here. So how and why a narcissistic parent targets the scapegoat child's efforts to take others for granted. In a child born to, again, the good enough family, the expectation is that the child will expect his or her needs to be met by the parents. The assumption here is that the parents in this type of family had their needs met well enough in their own childhoods and or did work on themselves to know that they as parents are healthily deserving of having their needs met, at least some of the time. As a result, they want to see their child get to know and have the child's own needs met. Pictures can sometimes help. So let's take a look at a diagram. Okay, so in this picture, we see the child's self, and then the green arrows represent others, especially parents' support, interest, attention, and love. So in this case, the child is focused on themselves and feels entitled for others to focus on them too. The child doesn't have to worry about the other's interest running out or the child getting attacked for, say, needing too much from these others. The child, in essence, gets to live in a world of being given to without having to pay it back. So in these situations, the child effectively gets to take the support from without for granted so that the child can focus on themselves in a very developmentally appropriate way. As a result, the blue circle that is the child's self is completely theirs. They get to build and strengthen a sense of self, and that self expects that others are there when needed to meet his or her needs. Now let's look at what happens as the child ages into an adolescent or adult with this kind of early experience. So the adolescent adult self in healthy development. So here we have the adolescent adult self on the left and another adolescent or adult sort of healthy self. Now here the arrows are, going in either direction. The adolescent adult self can focus on themselves and expect focus on them from another adult and willingly give the same back to the other adolescent or adult self. So between the adolescent adult's own self and the capacity of the other, they don't have to worry about being a burden to the other. So the adolescent adult who's had a healthy enough upbringing and got those needs met has something kind of in themselves that allows them to meet their own needs. And in conjunction with that, they have that unbroken, healthy expectation, even healthy entitlement, that at times others will be available to meet their needs too. So the adolescent adult in this case lives in a world where they take turns giving and receiving, and they can take the other for granted and be taken for granted in very healthy and reciprocal ways. Well, in the case of the child born to a narcissistic parent, the experience is tragically different. In this case, the narcissistic parent's efforts to manage their fragile yet inflated self-esteem often require that another person be used as the receptacle of that parent's intolerable feelings of worthlessness and shame. So enter the scapegoat child, who must keep the parent's willingness to care about the child intact as just a matter of survival. So this makes the child extremely vulnerable to the narcissistic parent's psychopathology. The result is that the child can be seen as the worthless one in relationship to the narcissistic parent, so that the parent doesn't have to feel these feelings about themselves. Next, the parent uses their authority in the relationship and the child's dependence on that parent to treat the child in ways meant to get the child to think about themselves as worthless. In other words, to get the child to identify with the parent's cast-off feelings of worthlessness. When this happens over and over, then the child is said to be put into the role of scapegoat to the narcissistic parent and has to build a sense of self that's imbued with, unfortunately, a kind of a sense of badness. The truth is that the badness is not the child's own, but must be ingested, psychologically speaking, as a sort of a perverse demonstration of loyalty to the narcissistic parent. When I say perverse, I don't mean that as a slight to the child. I mean it to reflect something about the demand placed upon them by the narcissistic parent. So let's take a look at the scapegoat child's self with a narcissistic parent. Here you can see that a few things are happening. Most of the child's sort of energies have to be directed outwards. I put one green arrow that may be seeking to meet the child's needs being there, but it's certainly not what is most common in the child's experience. Maybe it's a family friend or some other adult who shows a genuine interest and care about the child's needs. What's more kind of common is the narcissistic parent's needs for support, interest, attention, and love are sought to be met by the child. And that's what these kind of light-colored green arrows are for. So as I said, the child has to focus on the narcissistic parent more than themselves, as this diagram shows. Also, the child has less internal real estate for themselves. As you can see, in contrast to the other diagram, the blue territory has shrunk. So in essence, the child has to give up some territory of themselves to meet the demands of the narcissistic parent. The child now has to worry about the other's interest in them running out or, say, getting attacked by needing too much. Now the child lives in a world of constantly giving to, yet being told they don't give enough and that instead actually need too much. So let's look at the impact on the scapegoat child. The child now has to tend to someone else, the narcissistic parent, more than themselves, and typically in a very thankless manner. In other words, the scapegoat child gets taken for granted by the narcissistic parent, but is forbidden from using the parent in a similar fashion. Now the child must find a way to adapt to these harsh circumstances. One common way of doing this, I've found, is to develop a morality on the supposed virtue of self-deprivation. So the child has to believe that they don't deserve to have someone for them to, in essence, take for granted. But this belief can be held unconsciously, while consciously this virtue of self-deprivation is pursued. So the child, and later the adolescent and adult, may always be scanning the environment to find opportunities to help others or make sure that they are not taking up too many resources or making too many demands on others. But the price of violating this code of self-deprivation can be a profound experience of shame. So this ethos of self-deprivation, or this kind of moral code, fits very well into what the narcissistic parent requires from the child. Namely, that the parent be the only one who is allowed to get their needs met and take others for granted in doing so. The scapegoat child who disavows their own such needs to take the narcissistic parent for granted gets this sort of moral reward internally for doing so. The scapegoat child is also spared the narcissistic parent's wrath, which they might otherwise encounter if they expected more from that parent. And I think the moral reward they get is also getting spared that sense of shame that can be felt when they have, in the past, tried to exercise what is a healthy entitlement of sort of using someone else in a healthy way to help themselves, and then being met with rebuke and accusations of selfishness and the sort by the narcissistic parent. That is, if the child doesn't need anything from others, then they're not going to get that rebuke and they're not going to feel that sense of shame. But their development is going to get stunted in a sort of emotional way because they don't get to learn that others are there for helping them, because obviously that's not their situation at the time with the narcissistic parent. So how can the survivor recover their right to take others for granted? Again, in a healthy, good way. If these circumstances resonate with you that I've talked about today, then the next question may understandably be, well, what can I do about it now? I think that a lot of healing can happen in challenging and, over time, dismantling the morality built around self-deprivation for the scapegoat survivor. In order to establish satisfying and useful close relationships, we all need to be able to take the other person for granted at times to get our needs met. It's an essential part of the trust that's needed in such relationships. And in good relationships, there can be a measure of turn taking in taking others for granted. So for example, a spouse who has a problem at work may tell their partner about it, after they get work or shut off the Zoom screen. And the spouse has to assume that the other spouse will be interested and engaged in what they're saying. So in this very subtle way of taking their partner's interest and engagement for granted, the spouse gets to use the interaction to help them figure out how they want to address the problem at work. This may not seem like taking someone for granted because of how subtle it is, but in a narcissistically abusive relationship, the narcissist may claim that your expectations of their interest and engagement in, say, such a situation is taking that narcissist for granted in this somehow offensive way. The rejoinder that can be used usually in retrospect for the scapegoat survivor when the narcissistic abuser accused the person of taking them for granted, could have been something like, well, I'm really trying to, because that's what people are supposed to be able to do in relationships, but you just won't let me. Again, this is one of those hindsight kind of rejoinders that actually George Costanza made, I think, pretty famous in the one episode in Seinfeld where he thinks of good witticisms to give to a coworker who's needling him, but only like after the work when he's talking with Jerry. But anyway, that's a huge digression. In the same line or along the same lines is how I'm offering this rejoinder. Not to say one should have been able to say this to the narcissistic parent at the time, but to just illustrate the point that this was not something wrong that you as the child survivor, narcissistic parent was ever doing or expecting. In fact, it can, in retrospect, be kind of turned around. Why wasn't the narcissistic parent affording themselves or offering themselves to you at the time as their parent to take them for granted so you could promote your own development? That's in fact how things are supposed to work. But to get to that point, however, it can be important to challenge the system of morality, which is based on self-deprivation. And I think it can be critical to do this challenging in the context of relationships with safe people. The scapegoat survivor needs to accrue experience where someone else who matters to them takes their needs seriously, respects them, while also valuing the scapegoat's own availability to them. Therapy, I think, can be a useful way to find such experience and contrast these new experience from the rules you had to abide by while in relationship to the narcissistic parent or partner. Again, also, it's not just therapy, but regular relationships with good, safe people can also afford this. Well, I hope today's video might help you challenge the reflex of putting yourself last, lest you be accused of taking others for granted. Taking others for granted is actually a healthy thing that we should be able to do in good, safe, reciprocal relationships. And I would submit that you have a right to recover this. Well, thanks for watching today's video. I hope you found it useful in your own process of recovery. And I would invite comments below about your own, if this issue resonates, your own experience in, say, being accused of taking someone who is narcissistic for granted, and how you maybe even too you're working in your own recovery to reclaim this right and enjoy balanced reciprocal relationships as part of the path to recovery. Well, thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found it helpful, and I want to thank everyone for your continued comments and engagement with the videos and with each other. Again, the community that seems to be developing around the videos and has developed is just really a great thing, I think, for me to witness each week. And yeah, I look forward to posting again next week, Fridays at 9 a.m. Take care.